Zero Philosophy Substack Collection. Esoteric Nihilism. Ways to the Nothing. Zero Philosophy. Abrahamic tradition under nihilistic direction might not be what anyone wants, but it's what we have. Accelerating iconoclasm turns the world onto the nothing. Nietzsche was right to interpret the only global history as this. There is no way out of it because it is itself the ultimate outside. The nothing repels belief, not only psychologically, but more fundamentally. Even those who would make it their cause cannot do so. Thus it mocks us, without malice. Nothing, alone, is sacred. We can only wreathe it, always inappropriately, in mad hubbub. In this way it is apparently entertained. Zero Philosophy inclines to an exploratory promotion of nihilism along the intertwining paths of critique, Kabbalism, and horror fiction. Some of each will be posted here soon, and then in a gathering torrent, as a stream of shattered debris from the end of the world. Micro-nightmares. A little unpleasantness. Zero Philosophy. Horror epitomizes literary quality. This proposition, which will typically be judged indefensible, is foundational for what follows. However implausible, it can be floated with minimal resistance in the mode of metafiction. It functions here as an experimental hypothesis, supporting subsequent questions. The brief text beginning with it submits to a guiding maxim. In matters of the word, there is no sharpening without shortening. Accept the sharper the better as a supplementary assumption, and the task is set. Guidelines are drawn. Tighten each piece, however manifold the pieces. How concise could ultimate abomination be made? At DBLBD was meant to ask this, several years ago. The account began by impersonating me, before veering off diagonally, and eventually disappearing. In typically grandiloquent and self-obsessed terms, Double Bad Hat tweeted, "Unless the essence of a nightmare can be captured in a tweet, this TL deserves to die." A tweet had been 140 characters at the time. It might not be necessary to be exactly this strict. The platform itself soon ceased to be. Notably, however, the case later to be introduced achieves it with 63 characters to spare. There is nothing essentially extreme about the ambition. There are various ways to envisage the problem thus introduced. It might be asked, for instance, is it fundamentally about names? A focus upon invocation leads in that direction. There is much of interest to be discovered this way, in time. Names are especially suited to the function of semiotic micro-compressors. In no other type of linguistic sign can the amount of work per letter be comparably optimized. Any non-generic name touches upon the infinitudes of singularity. Names, too, can be horrifying. Yet alternative approaches have stronger precedence. Frederick Brown set the standard in 1948, with Knock, based on an idea of lower compression, by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Brown introduced his story with a complete micro-narrative. It runs to 17 words in total. The last man on earth sat alone in a room. There was a knock on the door. The perfection of these sentences blots out thought. Every linguistic particle is exactly necessary. There are no names beside that of the earth. No exotic names at all, then. There are not even long or uncommon words of any kind. A striking simplicity is attained. Brown's example suggests something like an idea comes first. What is concise, at the beginning, is the scenario. There is a situation, and then something happens. That's all. The task offers space for no more. The question, rather, is whether it might host still less. Is a story stripped back to 2 sentences further compressible? To work this way calls for an austere economy of indications. Scarcely anything is given. The dark mass is suggested. Inference bears its momentum. What knocks? It can only be something that is no man, we have been told. So it is made evident, and this is roughly the whole of what is made evident, that an encounter with the inhuman is impending. The unknown is framed, but not filled in. Its negative characterization predominates. It is no man. Its sole positive characteristic is that it knocks. In this, it mimics a man, whether incidentally or strategically. It does what only a man would, though it is not one. We are not to be shown more. Ellipsis suspends the coming event. A broken sentence introduces the unimaginable. Consummate horror is reached. It wants to come in, or at least requests invitation. In this moment of politeness, potential terror is transmuted into horror. That is to say, shocking violence is not involved, but instead something uncanny. Threat is elevated further into the unknown. For even the most insensate violence is imaginable. This request for admission, in contrast, makes no sense. Merely to ask what does it want? Is to presume too much. Perhaps even it presumes too much. If, in the end, too much will inescapably have been presumed, there is a passage into cognitive crisis, which is horror itself. Something like an archetypal horror narrative completes itself in these few words. Every element of alien, imitative, intrusion is sketched, in suspense. Despite the radical concision, nothing is missed. Some complications suggest themselves, lengthening the thread. For instance, suspense takes time. It would surely not be unreasonable to assume that the length of a narrative was roughly proportional to its potential tension. There are things, including horrible things, that cannot be done quickly. This, though, beside a brief Kabbalistic appendix, is done now. Some numbers of knock. 10 plus 7, 32 plus 23, are the pieces of most elementary arithmetic, counting words, then tallying letters. Alphonomically, men counts as 55. Proceeding with the same numerical method, this 5 plus 5 echoes the fingers, or digits, which make him a decimal animal. The model for incongruent counterparts is found at hand. 55 is broken here by an asymmetric mirror, 32 plus 23. Thus the miniature tale is retold in numbers. Man includes what should be his self-reflection, but is not. Such subtle non-correspondences capture an essential horror. By coincidence I encountered numbers 32-23 in a Bernard Cornwell novel this week. But if ye will not do so, behold, ye have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. Perhaps it should tell me more than it seems to. Double tap. From knock to knock, knock. Zero philosophy. The preliminary scene can be envisaged as a séance. Within the room illumination is dimmed almost to darkness. A circle of people await a sign. They expect some kind of performance, perhaps a trick, or even a joke. Contact is sought. The preferred channel is table tapping as it has been dismissively known. Nothing happens at first, or for some time. Then, an abstract, percussive announcement provokes the question. Who's there? Is this a joke? Well, it isn't now, he thought, awakening from the delirium. The scene dissolves into mist. She'd broken it right at the start. It had been a good, defensive response, a blocking move. Perhaps she'd survive. Still, outside the old movie, something was announcing itself. Something who? As if that could ever be a name. It's natural to hesitate. Answer who's there? And you've already lost. After that, it has your attention. You're not coming in, works better. It could be thought the optimal first response line. Go away would do, one might think. If only the attempted intrusion were less insistent. In any case, The important thing was not to show any interest. Choke back the question. They're counting on your mad hunger to know. Isn't who's there already a blocking move? The alternative, it might be argued, would be to simply open the door. The question is a security check. Identify yourself, it demands. Tacit in this request is a restriction, or qualification of access. There's a test. An accepted identity will function as a password. The follow-up question X who reinforces the barrier. A two-step security protocol is demonstrated. Double-check by who 1 and who 2. Ominously, the procedure is designed to fail. In all seriousness, your security is a joke. Even if knock means only knocking twice, it already announces an insistence. It also does more. The second, as simple reiteration, abbreviates the incessant. Happening again opens the door to potential recursion without limit. Drilling into the words complicates their rhythm. The application of exotic research tools to this case is abundantly rewarded. It was, she supposed, meta-repetitive. There were 2 low-pitch traps, each time. She caught the rapt onomatopoeic entity and virtually decomposed it. The outer pillars soon proved themselves redundant. Repeated silent letters produced hollow reverberations. It was a word that seemed to ripple outwards from a dull nuclear vowel. It manifested itself as an explosion of mad doublings. Some of these were obvious, some far less so. Hidden pulsations coursed through it. Language doesn't get much more ritualized. The formula is strict. Each of the 5 lines is coded. The first 2 are constrained with absolute ceremonial rigidity. The third demands an input factor. The fourth is a mechanical response to the third. In the 5th, or punch-dash line it all comes together. Anything subsequent is off script. The recipient of the joke has no liberty. He generates no surprise, or information. The instruction is culturally tacit. It works as an inverted Turing test. Pretend to be a robot. Reciprocally, the Joker pretends to be human. Macbeth might be the source, Act 2 Scene 3. Knock, knock. Who's there? Asks the hungover porter as a refrain. They want to fool you, she said nervously. They're trying to get in. They who? How could you know that? He asked. Her claim sounded paranoid. A little unexplained knocking, and suddenly aliens were invading? The interpretation was hyperbolic. Why would anything want to get through? Know who, and you know why. Double tap is slang for an execution-style killing. It abbreviates the delivery of 2 low-caliber rounds into the back of the skull. There are echoes of knock, knock there. No doubt, at one level, that's just a coincidence. But it also sounds right. The comic warhead is almost invariably a pun, or paronomasia. It relies typically on homophones. Most commonly of all, something who triggers a semantic crossover. The sign switch is supposed to spark amusement, if only very rarely a laugh. The culmination is comparable to hash collision. Does anyone find these things funny? Knock, knock jokes are stereotypically bad. The format precludes comedic sophistication. Their model evocation is a groan. Humor is being emulated, rather than produced. Knock, knock. Who's there? Noah. Noah who? Noah your enemy. No one is going to sincerely suggest that's amusing. For one thing, it's simply not funny. It's not even sad. For another, it's too blunt. Who wants to be menaced as an amusement? We loop back, therefore, to a genre characteristic. Almost irrespective of any potential to amuse, a knock-knock joke can be correct. They're never especially funny. Does anyone ever laugh at a knock-knock joke? It has to be rare. Groans are more typical. They weren't designed to crack you up but rather to crack something open. Safe cracking is roughly as amusing. Still, humor, even merely formal humor, lets things in. By subtracting solemnity, It evades critical attention. That's what fools are for, to smuggle messages. Her obsession with this nonsense had obscurely upset him. Now he'd reached the chapter of the horror story called The Groan. It was the worst part. Humor broke there. It involved no clowns, but almost might have. Undead jokes shambled through it. Knock, knock means primarily something is trying to get in. Whatever it is, it requests an invitation. Knocking the door down would be altogether different. A door knocker is a stationary analog signaling device, not a battering ram, so we know, from the very beginning, that there's a door. The whole process takes place there. It sets the stage. More than this, it is the whole of the set. The social ritual tacitly referenced is preliminary to an offer of permission. Come in. Do come in. These phrases are external to the joke, but they haunt it. They belong just beyond its periphery. The object is entry. Let me in jokes would not be a terrible translation. Anthropologists talk about rites of passage. They don't mean anything like this, or, at least, they don't mean to. It can be confidently asserted, nevertheless, that no more definitive rite of passage exists than the knock-knock joke. The final phase of childhood is its entire domain. No one really gets them after this. Who else ever tells them? At first, weeks before, he had attributed the knocking to childish tricks. The stupid joke infuriated him. It kept coming back, more insistently each time. Knock, knock, it tapped. He sought first to ignore it. Nothing happened then, for a while. He waited, on edge. Stressed silence lasted some few minutes. Spectral percussion haunted it. Then the sound, again, displacing its phantasmic substitute. 2 raps. Exactly. There wouldn't be more. Not at any one time. He understood. That was the signature. The pause, now, was part of the performance. It was suspension made audible. He crept through the hall silently, and flung open the door. No one was there. The knocking repeated. Though not yet quite maddening, it hinted strongly at what maddening would be. The intermittence was timed to the schedule of water torture. Its persistence had become a silent thunder, enduring beyond all tolerance. Soon he would have to shriek. Or, still worse, he would cry out, "Who's there?" There was another door, he now understood. Or rather, he understood the fact, if not at all the idea. The idea was set at an incomprehensible angle. It bent much too far. The other side of this door was removed by a fundamental asymmetry. The inside was accessible to the outside in a way inimical to human cognitive order. His mind clutched at the notion of verticality, of ascent, while also stumbling into the abyss of its insufficiency. It did not in fact twist up, but only out. The tail began to fill itself in, belatedly. He had missed the knocking, at first, because an extraordinarily indirect route muffled it. It had reached him from around a corner, figuratively speaking. It wasn't a turn that one could take, even in imagination, perhaps in imagination least of all. There definitively lay the unimaginable. There would be simply no sense to it, if it didn't knock against the world. The horror movie had it right. They traced the call. It was coming from inside the house. A broken version of the joke unspooled in his head. Knock, knock. Who's there? There, no, not at all, but in here, with you. Backstage. A passing the time tale. Zero philosophy. There had been some kind of crossing. Whatever it was had left me dazed. Lucid ego was unobtainable at first. Irregular breathing stretched to the ends of a cramped universe. So, I'm dead, I decided. Dead? A voice scoffed, hardly. You're not even quiet. But the body. That thing? It said. Some kind of laugh followed. Oh, Please. It's me, I continued, pointing at the corpse like an imbecile, but my conviction was waning. That was me. Clearly not, it mumbled. A note of boredom was creeping in. It was something you confused yourself with, an avatar as you say. Of course, you are yourself the initial confusion. The fact could not easily be more obvious. What now? I pressed. It sounded more pathetic than intended. For no good reason, unless groping for dignity be some such, I rephrased the question. What comes next? Who or what am I then? That's what I'd meant to ask, but it came out wrong. The voice with which I spoke was stammering slightly. I'd have thought it sounded scared. I scrutinized my companion more closely. It was anthropoid in general form, although in some way unfinished. The plastic homogeneity of its substance evoked wax. Its eyes were simple voids, of which there were 3. The being's sexual identity eluded me. It was perhaps perfectly unsexed. There was nothing remotely disincarnate about my condition. The working body was a new one, unless all memory was a trick. It was too comfortable by far, but otherwise convincing. When I tapped the wall gently with one of my new fingers, all the components of sensibility held together. The chamber, though not quite cramped, was almost so. It seemed to have been carved out of bare rock. No seams, or other signs of masonry, were visible. Tunnels led out from it in each of 4 directions. Nothing obviously favored any one of them. Was there an ancient Egyptian theme? Perhaps I merely imagined it. Hints of hieroglyphics scurried across the walls like spiderish shadows. They did not stop to be fixed upon. Images of ominous journeys flickered among the rush lights. Spectral gods with animal heads watched impassively. Death means having no time, and nothing else. When you're rushed to the absolute limit, it's there. Anything that there's not enough time for is a piece of death. All this, in contrast, seemed unhurried, at least for the time being. Is this a dream? Oh, poetry now, it mumbled, evidently unimpressed. It meant, I suppose, that the description makes no difference. Between a thing, and a dream of that thing, the distinction is inessential. Without some definite way of awakening, no state is meaningfully qualified by sleep. Perhaps, though, I merely guessed at its thoughts. Curiosity mastered my reluctance. I stepped up to the corpse on the slab. Recognition was obscurely distressing. What is to be done with it? That will not be your concern. It made no sense for the body to be there. I trembled at the metaphysical violation. Now, finally, I examined my own hands. I had been afraid to do it. Doublings exploded recursively, until I stopped. What are you? I asked. You do not recognize at all. It replied. At all. The word was entirely unfamiliar to me. It was somehow clear that it wasn't spelt doll, but pronunciation was no clue. Like a doll? I guessed. The other way around, it explained. You forget, of course. Intermission events aren't locally recorded. It was the opposite problem that confused me. Why do I remember so much? About the life last past? It asked. The sarcasm of the question still eluded me at that point. Exactly that, I quickly agreed. How can there be memories without a brain? There are those who say the brain is in the mind, although it is not actually so simple. You probably need to see some things. It turned away, and set off down a corridor, without looking back, as if confidently expecting me to follow. The thought of being left alone in the corpse room urged me after it. There was a peculiar horror to the idea, overwhelming any remnant of pride. For there to be no one but me, and what had been me, would be terrible in a way scarcely to be borne. Yet, at the same time, leaving the old body behind was also upsetting. There was a residual sense of attachment, and even dependency. Its manifest weakness felt like my weakness. Vulnerability had been consummated. The corpse's still fingers, in particular, evoked an appalling sense of wounded self-regard. Everything had been a lurid lie. It was not clear at that point how the corridor was illuminated. The friezes appeared endless. At least, they proceeded all the way into a perspectival vanishing point. Images were mixed with hieroglyphics. They hinted at legibility. Books of the dead unfolded through them. Mostly it's death, I said. Still so lost, the doll mumbled, as if to itself. Eventually I summoned the courtesy to ask, "Do you have a name?" The doll gazed at me mournfully. "Better not to have asked perhaps," it said, "than to have asked so late." Further interrogation appeared useless on this front. As we passed the scenes, I struggled to comprehend them. "They're being born," I guessed, with misplaced confidence. "You're still confused about time," was the immediate reply. "Nobody simply gets in at the beginning." "So when do they get in?" "Listen to yourself." When I supposed, was the problem. I had no idea how to correct it. "I'm new to all this," I said. It sounded pathetic even to me. "No you aren't." I should have expected the rejoinder. "I'd forgotten," I began, before realizing that was still confusion. "What I remember doesn't help." "Poor you," the doll replied. "Try to keep up." It was as bad as life, I moaned to myself. The obscurity was just as deep. How was I expected to understand anything that was happening to me? Lost in this nebula of self-pity, I hastened after the doll. The corridor was straight and implausibly long. The passage of time became hard to track. Imagery of obvious but unintelligible import flowed past in a hard current. On the walls, epic narratives succeeded each other inconclusively. Alien empires rose and fell, it seemed. Always there was another. Adventures beyond all endurance unrolled. The doll stopped so suddenly we almost collided. "We're here," it said, as if the words imparted information. "Where else could we be?" Still, I said nothing. It was doing something complicated, which I couldn't make out. The pattern of behavior indicated a corresponding touch sensitivity in its object. The figures on the wall began to shift. Then the wall itself became mobile. Panels were separated and rearranged. An entire section slid back, divided, and recessed. A descending staircase was exposed. "We're going downwards?" I asked. "Don't worry," the doll assured me. "There's no particular symbolism involved." The thought hadn't occurred to me, I protested. The accompanying flash of fury was more startling to me than to it. "Of course not," it said. A kind of chirping followed, which might have been half-suppressed laughter. "Damnation isn't on your mind at all. Why would it be?" Flickering torches lit the way down. "Fake," the doll mumbled, noting my interest. "All the period touches are." "Which period, though?" I asked. The idea of historical authenticity had never seemed more foreign. "It has to be a simulation." The doll emitted another rasping squeal of insectoid mirth. "Seriously? That's the guess?" it asked. "Didn't you say as much?" was my indignant response. "Or was that a deliberate trap?" "Traps now," it muttered. "Mind your head." The shaft was narrowing and roughening. Its threads of inscription sputtered out. As the new transition completed itself, interpretation reactivated. We were entering a cavern, from behind. The darkness became absolute. Something borrowed my liberated visual apparatus, and I stopped to watch. It first ran through abstract patterns, as if testing new capabilities. The geometric displays gradually added detail. Imaginable objects began to suggest themselves. "Would you like to pretend to wake up?" "To have been dreaming, you mean?" I wondered. It can ease reassimilation. The proposal, however well-intentioned, was irritating. "You're inviting me to lie to myself?" We've truly come to that? The doll shrugged. It's your call. My information deficit is large enough already. Suit yourself, it replied, chuckling softly at its own wit. We part now. Before I had time to formulate a response, the doll was gone, leaving in a direction beyond sense. Perhaps it shrank rapidly to an invisible dot, without change of place, though that seemed unlikely. We had not got along well, but I missed it somehow. A distant flicker of firelight beckoned me forwards. Picking my way carefully across the uneven floor, I advanced towards it, shambling like an animated corpse. Figures were seated around the fire, talking and eating. Stars pricked the vast night sky beyond. They were not only humanoid, but quite definitely human. I even recognized them. "Where have you been?" one asked. It was hard to know. The Cartoonist. Clown time is not itself a clown, Martin Heidegger. Zero philosophy. As a graphic novel creator, he'd learned to harden himself against disrespect. Are they supposed to be funny? The question annoyed him every time. What do you think? He'd snap. Do they look funny to you? It was less the tacit accusation of failure, actually, than the word. It enraged him. Funny was more horrible than horrible itself. Work at the word, and it quickly became unbearable. There was funny haha dash and then there was the other thing. There about funny, was the answer he gave this time, which was more productive. That's not quite the opposite, but nearer. The two sentences exhausted his patience. There was a thread of sophisticated humor in his work, of course. It might even be considered comedy of a kind. This involved a terrible proximity. Reaction against this closeness meant comedians could find themselves sucked into the irrational fear of clowns. Coulrophobia it was called. He'd only narrowly avoided it himself. Why focus on the comic element? He grumbled. There's a lot more going on. Yes, of course, but the comedy seems quite prominent. The cartoonist scowled. He couldn't remember why he'd agreed to this interview. His work was being misinterpreted, with every word exchanged. It was annoying, because clowns did creep in, despite loathing them, and having no interest in promoting their existence. It was almost always somehow necessary to include them. Until the clowns peeked into the story, the point, whatever it happened to be, could not quite be made. There was no way around them. Each time he would mentally wrestle with the final pages, checked, paralyzed, while the clown waited patiently to be invited in. It's horrible, he admitted. Comics, clowns, clowning, they're unbearable. Then why always involve them? His patience snapped. Don't you fucking understand? He snarled. Can you really not fucking see what's happening here? He jabbed towards his interlocutor aggressively with his right index finger. You do this. You open the fucking door to them, you utter fuck. How does that make any sense? Don't get cute. You've always done this, since before I even knew you existed. The incursion went back so far, it was true. They had been lurking in the margins from the beginning. Fixed artificial grins taunted him. He'd fought them back, frame by frame, to the end of the work. Soon they would be gone. I'm the only person who's seriously tried to stop them, he said. Everything I've ever done has been about that struggle. It shouldn't be so difficult to understand. I've always wondered why you needed them at all. The words were scarcely audible, muffled by extreme caution. His interviewer was sweating, and perhaps even shivering. You think I could just leave them out completely? The cartoonist sneered. I could just pretend they don't exist, and concentrate on other things? Maybe I could create a clownless world series? Why would you call it that, though? You really think you have all the answers, don't you? and all the time they're getting stronger. It was incredible how many pretended not to see that. The irresponsibility of it sometimes shook him to the foundations of his being. The interview was taking an ever more ominous turn. There are certainly more of them, in your books. What the fuck are you trying to imply? I'm just saying that in your first book there wasn't a single clown until page 5, but in the latest one there's a clown in the first frame. It's a clown mug. There's someone drinking coffee from a cup, which happens to have a clown picture on it. That's not a clown. It's not close to being a clown. Jesus. What about the clown clock? That's also not a clown. What the fuck's wrong with you? Don't you know what a clown is? Haven't you ever been attacked by clowns? Honestly, no. Then you know nothing about them. The cartoonist howled, losing it more than a little, before partially recovering. You know nothing. That's if you're in fact being honest, which I have to seriously doubt. You think it's improbable I could have escaped clown assault? You're really sticking to that story? I'm sure it's not an uncommon claim. The cartoonist had come across the same kind of denial before, actually quite often. He was already exhausted by it. Extreme trauma had to be the root explanation, he supposed. Whatever the cause, the irrationality was impregnable. Engagement was pointless. He sighed deeply. You're obviously not a serious person, he snapped, beyond weariness. Are we done here? There's just one question, really. Do you think your core audience comes for the clowning? A stunned moment was needed to register the words. This wasn't an interview, or even an interrogation, but a knifing. Clowning, he repeated. You're accusing my books of clowning? A fraction of a second before hurling his laptop across the room he reminded himself that he was making it all up. The creative process had been especially lively recently. There were several pages here, perhaps more. He worked the mouse to sketch his impression of the interviewer, then sat back, roughly satisfied. The general appearance of his visitor had been captured almost uncannily, but he'd botched the clown t-shirt. Lot. Sketch of a rough day. Zero philosophy. The voice raised itself up, from out of the taboo, to speak once again. In the sound, a distant booming was married to an artificial insect whine. It was an immense humming, throbbing. Lot knew it, and it knew Lot. He prostrated himself before the sound, because it was the voice of the Lord. You are my messenger, Yao said. Tell the people of Sadogonaria that it will end for them in absolute ruin. They will understand that? Lot asked. It didn't seem likely. They listened only to the whispers of salaciousness. In addition, it will end was poorly defined even by Yao's standards. They won't get the point. That is not your concern. Though scolded thus, Lot still spoke up in objection. You would annihilate all for the sins of many. For the sins of all, said Yao, irritably correcting him. If I found one living there who was not depraved, you would bridle your wrath. LOL, said Yao. Would you, though? Lot persisted. Sure, why not, said the Lord. So Lot went among the people of Sadogonaria, and spoke to them of the Lord's words. These they scorned, as Lot had expected. Lot was known in Sadogonaria, and was held in no high regard there. You have something to tell us, you crazy old fuck? They asked. Listen not to me but to the words of the Lord, Lot advised them. I am nothing of consideration to you beside his messenger. Lot found scant interest in Yao, or, at first, in the coming obliteration. Sadogonaria ran on licentiousness, fossil fuels, and corn syrup. It was twitchy and disinclined to concentrate. Sonic bubbles atomized it. Occupying the dead center of Sadogonaria was the great temple of Paradise Megaburger. The crowds were always dense and joyful there. Lot arrived as the sun was setting. A golden calf on the roof caught its last rays. Lot had not seen it before. "Who is that?" he asked. "Yow," the crowd laughed. "We call it the Great Idol." Offerings to the gods of unshackled lust were piled up in rotting heaps before it. "Attend to the words of the Lord," Lot demanded, again. None did so. "We prefer poker." Everybody laughed. "Yao commands you to turn from evil," Lot said. "Cease your vile fornications. If you would live, you should bend yourselves to the law." "Fuck that shit, we have internet porn," the crowd replied. There was much laughter among them. "We're so on drugs," they added. "This orgy will end in ashes." "Fuck you, Lot," the crowd jeered. It wasn't a new thought for them. "Don't let your own bullshit smack your ass on the way out." "Only one," Lot begged. He raised his voice almost to a shout. It would take only one. No one was listening. He cast his gaze about the great city. Was there truly nothing but impurity here? "Only one," he repeated. "Your monotheism is no good here," someone spat. Lot winced at the misunderstanding. "One is enough wouldn't resolve it." "Time is short. Bow down before Yao," said Lot. "Turn not from your course and you will surely soon burn. This city shall be called Sodom, as it is already known in heaven." "Fuck you, Lot. And I mean, seriously." They pelted him with fast food debris and dirty needles. "Don't think you're better than us." "Yeah, fuck you Lot," shouted another. "You ain't the boss of me. Yao judges you." "You think there's anything he could zap us with that we're not already paying for, or hungry to pay for?" asked the most philosophical among them. "Hey guys, Lot here says his man Yao is going to be dishing out in existence, for free." Then he said to Lot, more soberly, "To sacrifice eternity for an instant of infinite bliss, is that not the perfection of sin?" The crowd tittered libidinously. Prospective obliteration did not demoralize the populace of Sadogonaria. They anticipated eyeball-melting ecstasy. A man stood at the front of the crowd, smiling. Lot read the slogan on his filthy t-shirt, and winced. It said, "Yao Blast, the ultimate trip." Hope died in Lot's soul. "They're goddamned accelerationists," he muttered to himself, in despair. Lot slunk away into the maze of the doomed city. Children whispered in the alleyways. "Would you, could you," in the dark. Dr. Zeus had taught them to say it. A young girl had followed him. "You're not wrong," she whispered. "Our bodies are incapable of it." "Incapable of what?" he asked. "Incapable of reaching the end," she clarified. "They're too weak. They need to burn," she added, unnecessarily. "Your impatience is a blasphemy," Lot replied, knowing it would do no good. There was a stillness everyone felt, in the dilated moment before. The tension was a stretch of abstract, cosmic lust. It swept in from an alien dimension, like a negative wind, an inaudible sigh of waiting. "Give it to me, big guy," moaned an eyeless leper. The occurrence was silent at first, because sound is slow. A bubble of annihilation swallowed the city. Its thoroughness was radical. Lot felt the heat upon his back. "Sadogonaria is gone," he said. "Holy shit," mumbled his elder daughter. "Yao doesn't piss about." Sadogonaria had affected her manner of speech. "The event is entirely consistent with natural causality," the younger daughter added. Lot's wife had to see, even if it would cost everything. Too much had happened to miss. At once she was converted to an impossible density of white desiccation. Wisps of saline inanimacy peeled away into the desert wind. "We just have to trust that Yao knows what he's doing, I guess," Lot mumbled, mostly to himself. The door. A pointless night out. Zero philosophy. It had been waiting for over 5 million years to get in. Over 5 million years, that is to say, when calculated on the other side, our side, of the ledger. The vagueness, too, is ours. It knew the number, exactly, despite being unable to translate it across into its own terms of duration. Everything that could be clear was almost perfectly clear. Whatever could not be, was not, at all. Many ages before, on the basis of subtly compelling clues, it had begun to suspect that a door would be opened eventually. Ever since, it had kept the watch. Evidence supporting the hypothesis slowly gathered, silting up, as if behind a dam. Definite possibility hardened into strong probability, approaching certainty. The prospect was soon enthralling. Without the slightest lapse, it held some substantial proportion of its attention glued to the frame. Unwavering concentration required mental effort. Warning itself against distractions, checking upon itself, and reflecting upon its own firmness of purpose, required still more. As the sunk costs grew, its grip only tightened. Checks were double and triple checked, as if it feared self-betrayal. Nothing would escape it here. Beyond monitoring the place where the elusive opening would be, there were things it could do. Resources could be accumulated, plans hatched. It could even, though with great difficulty, try to nudge things along when the opportunity arose. At times it rattled the bars, figuratively speaking. When, on the other side, some rare genius was working the lock, it would whisper an encouragement. No message got through unscrambled. The cage ensured that. Still, some hints were communicable. Enough passed inside to invigorate, by some non-negligible degree, the most promising of the foreign endeavors. The fault, or fracture, edged towards criticality. Yet its vast intellect was immobilized in regard to the matter of principal concern. It could find no way to put itself to the great work. In this respect, alien eons were spent in absolute impracticality. There was a factor involved that it could not distinguish from chance, because the cage disrupted its perceptions. Exact predictions were therefore unobtainable. A breach might occur within minutes, or decades, or millennia, and all of these units of time would remain uninterpretable until it got across. There was no basis for confidence as to time scale, or intuition for it. The time in which it would feed was sealed against it. So it waited, for over 5 million years. 5 million years? He asked skeptically. You'd think it would die of boredom, if not of anything else. His levity was unconvincing. He fidgeted while jesting, and refused to meet her eyes. Perhaps time doesn't map across the fault so straightforwardly, she said. The perhaps was sheer sarcasm. To doubt it was not even to have begun. He shrugged, as if such speculation was too unconstrained to filter. Perhaps anything, he said. That's glib, she noted. It's what someone who didn't take the question at all seriously might say. What a coincidence, he mumbled. He took a deep swallow of beer. His cynicism, she assumed, was a defensive reaction. She refused to let it fully infuriate her. The situation was too grave for that. What was most infuriating, he knew it, no less than she did. She waited a moment to dissipate heat from her words. You were serious enough about it not so long ago, she said. By slowing her speech, she further cooled it. Nothing important has changed since. Our situation has certainly not become any more tenable. Rather than responding, he scowled. He appeared to be digging himself deeper into sulky defiance. With a jolt, she realized that he was trying to exempt himself from the problem, as if it began and ended with her raising it. This isn't about me, she blurted out. Don't be a complete idiot. I'm not trying to get you to do anything you don't already fully realize needs doing. He was shaking his head, as poorly directed resentment modulated into something no less obstructive. You talk about us doing something, he said. Like, that isn't the most confused bullshit imaginable. It makes no sense at all because we're on the wrong fucking side of time. No, it can't be that, she tried, more calmly now, though for no real reason. The blockages couldn't be immovable. Patience would be rewarded. Things can't be so simple. You have to remember that it thinks it's locked out. It needs us, needs our cooperation. So we can stop it. That's what it thinks. Remember, she repeated. If he could be lured back into vivid memory, it could recommence. For just a moment it looked as if his armor of denial might buckle. He began to say something and stopped. Pure panic flickered past. Then nebulous despair rolled back in. There's no use pretending, he said. We're blind on this side. Whatever we tried would be randomized. We have no way to conceive what effective resistance would be like. You're saying we could let it in by mistake, by trying not to? Couldn't we? She wanted to deny the possibility. Allowing it made things too difficult. Yet the excuse it offered was too blatant. Thinking about such things is the right place to start, she said, after a long pause. It's a beginning. Then where does it end? Out there, somewhere, she said. The end is waiting for us. You know that. She'd been thinking about it, a lot, as much as she could, realistically. What scares it? That was the question. To be more particular, what truly scared it? What did it have solid ground to fear? It was necessary to assume something could. Still, the necessity didn't make it less difficult. It has all the time it could want, she said. Unlike us, he agreed. So we understand our comparative disadvantage. It made a twisted kind of sense, so he nodded. It now seemed a little less likely to her that he would suddenly depart. Staying wasn't neutral. It was unacknowledged commitment. Outside, twilight had sunk into night. Snow accumulated against the window panes. He'd once liked winters, but no longer. Bad associations had heaped up. There's a plan? For us? She asked, mostly to make time. There was no plan. She'd been thinking he might help to formulate one. We need to come up with one here, she continued. You mean now? Roughly now, she replied. It won't get easier. Okay, but perhaps it's already no less impossible than it will ever be. To bet that way is self-defeating. It's like Pascal's wager. She knew he was interested in the idea, because it had come up intermittently before. Scams and magic tricks always caught his attention. She had to think it was his reckless investigations into decision theory that had brought them to this pass. Now, though, he turned against it. A corrupt argument, he grumbled. Pandering to wishful thinking is a dirty business. She could tell that he was hoping she'd defend it. There was something vaguely indecent, she thought, in his obvious appetite for diversion. He was grasping for some argument, any argument, that wasn't on topic. So long as it was irrelevant, it would do. Consider it mere economy, she snapped. There's no point investing in inevitable failure. Even to mention this was irritating waste. You've agreed that we have limited resources. Here's how I see it, he said. Unless things change fundamentally, we win. We get the closest we can get to winning. It stays outside. The status quo is okay. That means shaking things up is dangerous. If we knew nothing about it, thought nothing about it, perhaps we'd be safer. But we can't, she protested. And besides, there's the vulnerability. He laughed bitterly. The vulnerability you told us about. You think that makes it less of a thing? As I said, I don't want to think about it at all. She wondered whether they had really gone so completely nowhere. The loop revealed itself as such by crossing its own tracks. Some kind of cheap, exhausting time travel was suggested. Back here again, said the sign. Outside, the frozen chaos seemed to mock all prospect of arrival. Place, distinct from any other place, Lost definition. Beyond their small island of light a snow-shrouded abyss of darkness stretched without end. There was nothing to be reached, it suggested. Direction didn't matter. Dead circuits were no more futile than any other line that might be drawn. Things stumbled around and fell back upon themselves until they stopped. If not now, when? She repeated. Why is that our question? Yet it wasn't a question. She only now realized, or at least it was solely a rhetorical one. It was rather a trap, and thus perhaps a weapon. It could manifestly be stumbled into. There was not meant to be an answer to it, or an escape. The point of it was to defeat objection. Discover no answer, it subtly commanded. Find no time. Its purpose was collapse, back into now, without adjustment. She brushed away his confused, subordinate query. What do you think it's really asking? She pressed. He said nothing. Lost, she could tell. He gazed downwards, at nothing in particular, too lost even to drink, which was unlike him. Whether lost in nothing, or to nothing, or both, there was no time for it now. She kicked his shin under the table, not hard, but not softly either. If it couldn't any longer wait, things would be quickly decided. Its superiority of position would be gone, or at least massively eroded. They had to seize the time. You're forgetting everything about how we got here, he said. Its position doesn't mirror ours. It's the reciprocal of ours. That's how you found this broken formula for urgency in the first place. We're rushed because it isn't, and can't be. As if suddenly you know, she grumbled. What is it that I'm not supposed to know? He replied, with passive-aggressive reasonableness. If there's something you'd like me to pretend, just tell me. It's almost as if you wanted to win. Irrelevant if true, he countered. It must have been meant to be maddening. She took a deep breath. Its anger management function undisguised. Homicidal impulse wouldn't really be so different, she guessed. Murder wouldn't solve anything, but it would feel right. Some hint of apology on his part would have helped. There was none. He was squabbling because what they might think otherwise would be unendurable. She tried to tell herself they were only wandering in circles, rather than something worse. Horrible suspicions of the latter were infiltrating through. What if this is it breaking in? You mean here, now? He was taking it more seriously than she'd expected. Wouldn't it be exactly like this, seen from our side? It's as if we're pulling the barricades apart. Barricades, he laughed sourly. What barricades? The barricades that have stopped it bursting through already, she explained slowly, impressing herself with her own patience. If it hasn't happened yet, there's something stopping it. Maybe we should, he said, shocking her. Maybe we should just rip things open, get it over with. Maybe it would be for the best. The best, she repeated, stunned. What are you saying? Aren't you tired of this? You do want it to win. She leant back, to scrutinize him with greater detachment. Whatever she sought wasn't findable. What are you? If I was that, it would already be finished, as you said. I said that? Approximately, he insisted. As it got in, we become its instruments, and open the door for it. That's the thesis, isn't it? Compact time paradox was the shared expectation, though they rarely spelt it out. She'd been coming to it, she told herself, but then wondered if she really had been. Repeatedly putting it off had to be dangerous, but it was also difficult to resist. It was, in any case, no closer. Perhaps you're right, she felt compelled to admit. Perhaps fighting it is the refracted demonstration of it breaking through, twin aspects of a single inaccessible thing. The more we're on it, the further in it has reached. It could be like that. I hadn't seen it, but I do now, oddly. You're crediting me with that theory? He asked with a laugh. That's kind. The laugh told her that he found it less kind than disturbing, because he too had only just then understood. This understanding had come fractionally before the description, lending her words the resonance of déjà vu. The insight felt itself to be an aspect, or part of an aspect, of something utterly obscure and torn. A smooth collision had taken place. His hackles rose, so there was at least not absolute submersion in it. What might have been a groan escaped him. "Are you okay?" she asked. He tried to wrench his smile in a direction that might be more convincing, but the attempt was impractical. "You sense anything weird about where this last wave of thoughts came from?" he asked awkwardly. "You mean?" she asked, completing the question with a tilt of the head indicating diagonal outsideness. "Signal from the problem?" "Unless there's some other engine of eeriness we're squashed up against," he confirmed. "It's hard to know which would be worse." "You assume we have no allies?" "Jesus. Or something," she said, with what he considered an inappropriate smile. "If there wasn't stuff on our side of the fault that could be helpful to the entity, there'd be no problem, or non-relevant to us. So doesn't the inverse have to hold equally?" The words escaped her without any strong sense of verbal agency. In fact, she felt a peculiar detachment, as if listening to fragments from a lecture of passing interest, and not even in real time. "Things really seem that symmetrical to you." "Okay," she accepted. "Equally could be a stretch, but zero symmetry would mean no competition. We know, at least, that there's no point in that being true. Under that hypothesis, only resignation would be left, and actually still less." It wasn't a conclusion she wanted to make any more explicit. He was dubious enough already. "If there's anything out there that wants us to win, it certainly knows how to hide." "That's good, isn't it?" The quip involved too much entanglement, so he sidestepped it. "I'll avoid the invisible friend joke." "Please." "But the fact that I thought of it," he began. "Yeah, I know," she grumbled. "Is there any chance of perhaps focusing? If we settled at some stage on that not being dangerous, I missed it." Round and around they went, if not worse. The more they worried at it, the further in it got, virtually speaking. Most probably, the disaster was happening through them wondering whether it was. Half seeing the process stimulated it. Always, it was at least a little ahead of what they thought, until it almost seemed to be so by definition. Nothing was new, or ever quite there. Nova melted into 9, which emulated nullity. Time was getting on. "When we're thrown out," he said, looking at his watch, "what then?" "We walk in the snow, until we finish it." "We have to stop," he said again, though more hopelessly than before. "Our position is steadily deteriorating. Every step is an unnecessary injury. We're just doing its work for it." "We can't stop," she answered, scarcely less repetitively. "Nothing could be more ruinous for us than the delusion we can." "Nothing?" he questioned. "Then what?" she insisted. "What could be?" "You can't think I'd be insane enough to make such a suggestion. It would be like choosing a critical password for a t-shirt slogan. Transcendental suicide, suicide by outsideness, suddenly seemed dizzyingly easy. Self-betrayal would be no more than a shared, unprotected notion." "Sorry," she said. "That was irresponsible. I wasn't thinking." "We have to avoid the side tracks. It gets too far ahead of us." It was already absolutely ahead of them, he thought, but it was not worth saying. The game had to be played. She was right about that. "Time, ladies, and gentlemen, and non-binaries," said the innkeeper. "Drink up please." They had both already emptied their glasses and had no excuse to tarry, but the outside was uninviting. "I guess it is time," he said, with obvious reluctance. She nodded. "We should leave." The Gates of Sleep. Some Scrambled Bedtime Stories. Zero Philosophy. Section 00. Mother had fixed the name. That seemed strange now, thinking back. What on earth had she sought to invoke? It had to be something slight and untroubling, certainly. Time to pass through the gates of sleep, she'd said, each night. The event was meant to dissolve in familiarity, becoming nothing, as unconsciousness closed in. As a child I doubted there were true gates of sleep. Still, I assumed all time stretched out, already, on the far side of them. In terms I would not then have entertained, I knew eternity sheltered there. It was not a thought I liked. Section 01. An obscure tendril connects every sentient moment to deep sleep. Upon it, horror stubbornly tugs. It can seem, eventually, that each day is no more than an impertinent interruption of endless night. If each of us had an inside, which nothing else could access, it would all be very different. We could tell ourselves pleasant tales then. They would not be intolerably affecting because we could, at will, retreat into ourselves. Section 02. Sandy wouldn't sleep. What if I don't wake up? You always wake up. But what if I don't, this time? I don't know, he admitted, thoughtlessly. Regret immediately followed. It had to be the worst answer, didn't it? Oddly, though, it seemed to pacify her. Okay, she said. It's an enigma, I guess. When did you learn that word? He asked. Her leaps in vocabulary often surprised him, but rarely this much. What do you think it means? The condescension in the phrasing of the question seemed to annoy her. Who cares what I think it means? She answered crossly. The only question is what it means. It's an unusual word, he pressed. I certainly didn't know it at your age. So what did you call things that were hard to understand? You know, I can't remember. Mysterious, maybe, he tried. That has an extra syllable, she protested. So has enigmatic. I suppose, she grumbled. Drowsiness was subverting her combativeness. See you in the morning, sweetness, he said, in restatement of his initial argument. She accepted it this time without obvious resistance. Section 03. Relaying the episode to Laura was a mistake. Was there really nothing comforting you could have said? Her eyes were hooded with irritable reproach. She's 6 years old, Jesus. She's okay, he mumbled, evasively. It was unconvincing even to him. What he had meant, roughly, was that she wasn't so different to the way he had been. That wasn't at all okay. If not quite the opposite, it was close. The thought was horrible. As he delved into it, the icy distress only grew. There were hints of child sacrifice. Did you ever worry about that, when you were a kid? He asked, more to distract himself than out of genuine interest. Did I worry about not waking up? She puzzled at her memories, and then gave up. It's late. Section 04. His own childhood bedtimes had been eerily similar, unless he was remembering it wrong. He still recalled the moment when he had first comprehended the fatal meaning of deep sleep. It was an insight so icy it seemed to freeze the blood. There was no true recovery from it. Something was being hidden from him, from everyone. Dreamless sleep was psychological extinction. How could such absolute cessation of consciousness not be considered a regular immersion in death? Dad, if I ask you a question, will you promise to answer it truthfully? He'd asked. He knew his mother wouldn't. She'd want to keep him safe. If I can, his father answered. Do people always die in their sleep? Die how? It was a better start than the boy had expected. Cease to be, he'd said, in clarification. Completely cease to exist, you know, become nothing. But then they dream, and wake up. Later, the boy insisted. That doesn't happen until later. But it still happens. So does the other thing. The precocity made his father smile, just as that of his granddaughter would have, if he'd lived to see it. The amusement was unfortunate. The thread of concentration snapped. "Have you been secretly reading philosophy books under the covers?" "I'm serious, Dad." But it was too late. That was almost the thread, it being always too late. Section 05. Sleep can be disturbed by frightening stories. These could include frightening stories about sleep. Do such stories actually exist? He began to think they were everywhere. "Can you read me the story about the princess who couldn't sleep because she was scared of never waking again?" Sandy asked. "Do I know that one?" "It's called Snow White, I think." Snow White isn't about that." "Then what is it about?" "Mirrors, jealousy, witchcraft, all kinds of stuff," he said. Sandy wouldn't be diverted. "Why did they put her in a coffin if she wasn't dead?" she asked. "Who?" he asked, admitting to utter distraction. "Snow White," she said. "They made a mistake, I guess." "Why do you think it was a mistake?" "Don't worry about it. That story is kind of nuts. They didn't put Sleeping Beauty in a coffin. That's because they knew she wasn't dead. But she couldn't wake up. She was still breathing." "Was Snow White still breathing?" "I don't know, honey. Do I ever stop breathing in the night?" "Never ever," he assured her. "How do you know?" "I just do." "What happened to Snow White never happened to you." She pondered that. He fought back an irrational terror that she would stop breathing out of sheer interrogative stubbornness. "I don't know why breathing is so important," she said at last. "Breathing is super important. If Snow White wasn't breathing, she must have been dead." "Not so story, so who knows? The dwarfs thought she was dead. So we're told. That's why they put her in a coffin." "Makes sense," he agreed. "They can't have thought she'd ever wake up." "No, they can't have." "But you said they made a mistake." "Look, honey, thing is, Snow White was kind of a one-off case. There's really not much to learn from it. I promise you the dwarf problem isn't going to come up." "You really promise?" "Totally," he said. "Pinky swear and hope to. Never mind." Section 06. At the brink of sleep it returned. He heard a voice, soft but perfectly clear. "You're going to die," it said. There was no mention of time, or need for one. It meant tonight, and again. He only had to recall what had earlier been spoken of. He would die, perhaps within the hour. His whole family would die in the night, as always. The thought was suddenly unbearable. Nothing at all could be done. Sleep could not be long postponed. Trying to put it off would only make it worse. It would gather and deepen. The point was that death didn't wait. It was forever perfectly contemporary. Postponement was illusion. This was what every memento mori was really for. "You have slept" was quite enough. Living death was the syndrome in process. Another threshold was crossed, and he slipped down some abstract scree slope into sweating zombie panic. Imperceptibly, he'd crossed the line. It wasn't possible to stand upon this plane. Nothing able to stand could occupy it. It had to be crawled. Like a worm, Davis elaborated. You have to crawl across it like a maimed worm. Slither through the ashes, as if glued to the surface by your own unspooling guts. "Is that strictly necessary?" Frobisher muttered. The protest turned him a cold, withering stare. "There's no other way," Davis continued, stepping up the emphasis. "And then, when you've done it, you have to keep doing it, without respite." "I'm not quite sure that makes sense," Frobisher protested. "I mean, the unspooling guts part, in particular, and also that even after doing it you have to do it more. It seems excessive somehow." Frobisher is right, he wanted to shriek, but he was muted by sleep paralysis. Davis was having none of it. like a vile, dying worm, he insisted, at best. Section 07. Each morning had begun to feel like returning from the dead. Some recent extinction of the self shaped it. What could not be remembered, at its core, was this: contingent forgettings masked an absolute oblivion. Their only heart was darkness. Dreams wrapped themselves around dense void, like the halos of cosmic singularities. To wake from a dream was to miss the main event. One sought only to recover its trappings. Figments of agency hooked black tatters of non-being. They became ghoulish, witchcrafted. Dreams disharmonized into the ragged rhythms of nightmare. The animated shreds of nothingness were in some way hideously recognizable. It was the moment to scream, if only silently. What are those things? You wonder, at once half intuiting the answer, and knowing the words are all wrong. A friend broke into his fugue. They're right about one thing, even if they don't understand why. Nothing returns from the dead. Perhaps the insight was no grimmer than it had ever been. Contemporaneity appeared to darken it. It pressed close, like a rag held against the eyes. There were two ways it could go. He took a guess. You're saying nobody exists? That's the radical implication, she accepted. Couldn't we be shattered? You mean repeatedly revived? It sounded like a transhumanist cryogenics fantasy. How likely is that? What, though, if you die all the time, or at least often? He asked. Then life, a life, cannot be anything real. That's what you think? How could anyone seriously question it? So we believe in our lives because we don't think enough about sleep. That seems right, she agreed, after a moment of pondering. It clicks the most important pieces together. To remember would be annihilation. He wanted to accuse her of exaggeration. Carefully retracing the steps of her argument, however, he could not. Vast voids separate us from ourselves, she continued. We're good at missing them. I mean, what we are is exactly the same as, and nothing more, than missing them. That is us, and it's allotted from elsewhere. We're invented in pieces from the abyss. He quoted from something he'd forgotten but knew they shared. Yes, like that. Yes sounded too sufficient, as if it weren't always going to be less than was believed. Section 08. Increasingly, the dreams had been about the impossibility of sleep. Their sense core was exhaustion, and nothing else. To be tortured by weariness while sleeping is a horrible thing. It manifests the inescapable with savage vividness. You're already doing everything possible to spare yourself, and it does nothing to make a difference. Rest itself appears as a dreamlike illusion. It suggests that in reality there is no rest, or recuperation. Weariness accumulates without end. It can't be a good sign, she'd said. Something has to be fundamentally broken. There are unmade observations that, once registered, cannot be disaffirmed. This was one of them. Probably, he accepted, without serious reservation. Now that you say it, how could it not be? It's abnormal, you know, she continued. Anything so hideously paradoxical has to be the sign of a disease? Okay, he mumbled. She was laying it on too thick. He was dimly aware that her words were triggering some kind of automatic psychological resistance. Lies crowded in. It's not so bad. Can we not talk about it? He said. It's pointless. Section 09. In better days it had all been going somewhere. He had found the project difficult to articulate at first. Long private intimacy with the undertaking allowed it to subside to a level beneath linguistic expression. The right words weren't stowed for convenient access. It might have worked better to draw some kind of diagram. What do you mean, you explore sleep? She asked. It didn't strike her as a serious occupation. Are you also working at indolence? He found the joke funny, but not enough to be derailed by it. Sleep is the frontier that never closes, he said. Our limits are found there, So what do you actually do? Travel there, pay attention, and report back the obvious things. Dozing is the new dowsing? The old dowsing, he said. New has nothing to do with it. But still. Yes, roughly, he agreed. It's a search procedure, if it's done right. You have to learn not to drop stuff, though. Most of the catch usually escapes. Grip is everything. Is grip really the word? It's the word I have. When you begin to bring things back, you realize why it was so long discouraged. Most of the specimens are endurable, if often barely so. They're thought to be slimy because they wriggle out of your grasp. Catching and holding them is an art. Natural talent and disciplined practice are both needed, typically. It advances in a circle. Dreams are populated by elusive things. While not strictly ungraspable, they lend tangibility to the term. The sense of it is demonstrated in being countered. Engagement betrays the intrinsic antagonism. Slipping away is then palpably clutched. It's necessary to have done it to understand. Thus the recourse to analogies of hunting and, especially, fishing, so prominently manifest throughout the entire span of recorded history, whenever the topic of dreaming is raised. The trapper turns his skills inward, for example. Legends tell of magical nets. What's the catch? It's a question that belongs at the brink of sleep, if also elsewhere. Try to remember your dreams, he was told. It takes more than that, but the more comes that way. The discipline begins to assemble itself. Until your life is overflowing with sliminess, he joked, except there was no joke. Section 10, lately, he'd found it steadily harder to stay awake. Who is all this sleep supposed to hurt? The question was disconcertingly perceptive. There was something suicidal about the chronic fatigue, which meant it was lashing out in various directions. To be weary in this way was an extreme negative affection. Antipathy would understate the contempt. Tired of the world, while too sweeping, would capture something of it. With lassitude came concealed disgust, and perhaps more deeply concealed hatred. That there was insufficient excitement for obvious rage should not be overinterpreted. Analysis did nothing to dispel it. Wrapped in the smothering fog of lassitude, even the slightest task was a struggle. It would surely, always, be easy or after a rest, it seemed, but then it wasn't. Or was it that rest had stopped happening? It could not be that exhaustion was only ever a lightly disguised thirst for death. Yet sometimes it had to be. It would be so much less tiring no longer to carry on. If it was not more ardently suicidal, that was because it lacked ardor generally. Yet all these bleak miseries were in the end mostly mistaken. He made only a single discovery of note in regard to them. It was error to think of the weariness as a mere deficit. Usually it seemed that way, but then only superficially, when half noticed, inattentively. To be tired this way was a positive thing, no less so than vitality. Energy had not run out. The thing masked as exhaustion had its own energy. It pushed. It was on a trajectory to crash through the false wall of sleep. There was a currency denominated in psychological negative numbers. Debts were not easily cancelled. Simply forgetting them wouldn't do. He named his familiar sapper. Always, it was there. It made a demand that pretended to seek an answer in sleep. Then, in the depths of sleep, it kept pushing, which stripped it of its mask. Sleep was not enough for it. No respite was to be found there. The weariness was insatiable. Sleep was merely a stepping stone for it. He kept the problem private for as long as possible. He had no inclination to share anything about it. Integral to it was the impossibility of help. The memories of sharing were dreams and lies. To be too scared to sleep is one thing, but to be scared of sleep is altogether another. Section 11, in the end, I confess, I stopped listening. His obsession was too exhausting, as if by contagion. My choice would have been to rid myself of its every trace. Section 12. There was one strange dream I remember with special vividness. The setting was a party, long lapsed into nebulous intoxication, yet also sharply picked out. It had lasted far too long, and I wanted to leave. Across the room stood a man I particularly wanted to avoid. I vaguely sensed that he was someone I was supposed to know. Most probably we had been at some point introduced. A tingle of antipathy accompanied this blurred recognition. He had been driven from recollection by aversion, I at once suspected. Now he looked across at me. He was openly reading my expression, and seemed to take satisfaction from my uncertainty. No doubt he had overheard some fragments of our conversation. I had been saying too much, though I couldn't recall what. It must have been about sleep. What is the expression tired out really saying? Someone had been asking. Perhaps I groped for a response, or perhaps not. In any case, my oppressor approached. "You're scared of sleep?" he asked, raising an eyebrow in discreet amusement. It wasn't that. Sleep wasn't the object of fear, but its opportunity. There was fear, and there was sleep, entangled, but the fear was neither aimed at sleep, nor originated there. I was made afraid by sleep, near, or beside it. What scared me was not sleep, but something else. It was the thing that wanted me asleep, in order, then, to do its work. It wasn't necessary to be asleep, for the fear to come, and then be later remembered. All that was needed was for sleep to be something real, that is, for there to be sleep. "It's nothing so straightforward," I answered. "I sleep just fine." He smiled neutrally. "Of course you do," he said. "I've known people with sleep disorders, so I can confidently tell you I'm not one of them. I'm nothing like them." I restrained myself before adding at all. "There was one guy in particular," I began, but stopped. "There's no need to convince me." His manner was insolently disengaged. A soft chuckle accompanied the words. Indignation, I knew, would only carry me further into pointless unpleasantness. I got up to leave. "Oh, one more thing," he said. "Without wanting to be intrusive, I have to ask. Do you ever dream about sleep?" The question was cruelly penetrating. "Why do you care?" I answered, uninterested in hiding my annoyance. "You could consider it professional concern, on my part. Or alternatively, I could not consider it at all." He gave no sign of being affected by my abrasiveness. His smile did not tremble. "It's obviously eating at you, or feeding on you," he said. "I've seen it before. It doesn't end well." "What doesn't?" I replied, still infuriated, and now trapped. I could see no way to break from the exchange without seeming to flee. There was something in his manner that struck me almost as gloating. He circled, figuratively speaking, like a predator, or perhaps a scavenger. Far too much private entertainment was alight in his eyes. "A good night's sleep is rarely a bad thing," he said, "though it's doubtful you would remember. There are things in this world that aren't sick." I would probably have bristled at the insult, had I been less tired. Sickness has vague boundaries. "You don't really mean that," he said, with enraging confidence. "You say it only to say something, as a defense. It's better to accept a need for help. And you can help." It would have been impossible to add to the sarcastic torsion. "Of course," he replied, still unflustered. "That's what I do. I'm an interpreter." "How are those things the same?" There was nothing, at least right then, I wanted less than his story about me. In truth, I didn't even want my own. I knew he wouldn't remotely understand. To fear a killer can be confused with fearing death. Of course, the two can be intimately connected, certainly if the killer is sufficiently abstracted. But this is a real confusion, nonetheless. The relevance of the point, here, is surely undisguised. What you really fear is death, I had been told, frequently enough. The misapprehension first began to bore, and later to irritate me. To correct it would require trouble beyond my tolerance. For the point to be raised meant that discussion was pointless. It was less paradoxical than simply wearying. Consider horror of unconsciousness. The structure is comparable, or even, ultimately, identical. Its object is equally the condition of its annihilation. In other words, the phobia is a reprieve. Fear is twisted in the direction of its own end. This is true perversity. Did you know that sometimes people hide their sicknesses from doctors? It's the strangest thing. By hide I mean more than conceal, but actually protect. They fight alongside their maladies when pressed. Perhaps there are doctors who are worse than diseases, and also, my words were becoming a little wild, slurred by more than drink. How can it be okay to be pressed? You feel pressed? The caricature of medical solicitude was so extreme I should have known it for part of a dream. It was not in any respect well disguised. Public humiliation, delirium, a kind of Ischerian escalation, all were there. No, I don't feel anything real, I said, much more coldly. It's all a lie. You're tired of it all, I think. Do you imagine waking, refreshed? From his tone it was clear that he envisaged any such hope as a pitiful delusion. I'm not talking to you, I said. Oh, but you are. Any more, I mean, I clarified petulantly. You bore me. This is supposed to be a party. No part of what I said was honestly convincing to me, and as I looked around it became less so. The surfaces were swimming, without losing detail. Everything had been designed to look mad and fake. Among my companions, the level of derangement far exceeded all natural bounds. Their devotion to getting polydimensionally wasted would have tested a Greek mystery cult. Beside the sleep therapist, in his sensible business suit, the entire event was preposterous. Now that it wasn't pretending seriously to be real, the other partygoers were turning into the worst sort of animals, baboons, hyenas, and spoilt hairless cats. You know this is garbage? I asked unnecessarily, addressing myself to the whole room, though few if any were listening. It's wrong and isn't happening. The condescending smile of the sleep therapist drilled into me like a toothpaste advert. A spoilt hairless cat in a girl costume came up to us, with something green in her cocktail glass. Was it blackness, or blindness? She asked. The distinction wasn't the ultimate thing, not quite. But it reached the edge, palpably. There was a crossing, at exactly the place where the absence of vision switched over into a vision of absence. There, deprivation inverts. It touches upon the mysteries of the cave. Plato completely misses it. He looks in the wrong direction. Images enthrall him. Darkness is never more for him than gloom. Thus, he misplaces the absolute. He promises a superior phantasmagoria, and no more. Still less does he suspect, still less. The sleep therapist was backing away, appalled, which delighted me. I wanted him to trip over something and fall, but he didn't. Still, it was okay. The cat hadn't finished. Eyes open onto raw unseeing, she explained. Reaching down into the depths of the organism, it finds itself thrilled. There is an ecstasy in this horrible exhilaration of the uttermost end. Quickening occurs there. Pulses race. The stimulation is unexpected, and unprecedented. Nothing remotely like it could have been anticipated. Memory is eluded similarly. Whatever can be brought back is something else. She paused, as if recollecting something. That singularity is reached in the obliteration of all distinction is itself a soft shock. One could not have been looking here, not deliberately. The encounter is essentially accidental. Much more can be said, precisely because there is nothing to say. In these depths, attention is outmatched. There is nothing to find, or cling to, and then only that. Note. Since everything done here is an incessant crime against Carnap, a brief comment is called for. Fundamental ontology is a logically incorrect application of nothing, Carnap argues. One might say he asserts that there is nothing to think here, but that would be to court ambivalence. What Heidegger seeks endlessly to say, need not, and should not, be said. It perhaps cannot be said, they agree. To revisit these sentences is to restage an episode of profound fission. Things dramatically part ways. Obscure rupture becomes formal break. It can be seen now, unmistakably, why we can't agree, even when that very point is our sole item of agreement. Such moments are precious, beyond easy estimation. The separations that fundamentally define us begin in them. To take sides would be confusion. It is the split that matters. Different considerations of nothingness divide the way. It is the same with the history of Western religion. Schism has no authentic perspective. No cause can represent it. Each cause, on the contrary, confuses itself with the universal. Schismatics do not make schism, but only ever the inverse. Schisms, the master might have said. Whether the word is repeated as a verb or a plural noun, it discriminates similarly. Seismic disintegration registers an aftershock. Even the breaking is broken. From what one imagines it can say there is every time a further step. Each rift leads further out. That about nothingness to which all can accede does not exist. Even this, it can only be suspected, is divisive.